In 1944, I was Sasha, just Sasha, a boy from Kazan with a Communist Party pin I polished nightly and a rifle I'd named Natasha, after a girl who wrote me letters until Leningrad fell. My hands still had softness then. My NKVD file listed my age as 22, my skills as adequate, my political reliability as unquestioning. By then, I'd seen 3 winters on the Eastern Front, where cold killed more of us than Germans ever did. "Sashenka, your face is longer than the breadlines back home," Kaz would say, punching my arm hard enough to leave bruises as we hauled ammunition crates through mud that reached our knees. "Still writing poems in your head about that farm girl with the cross eyes?" "What was her name? The one with the magnificent—" "Tetieva," I'd correct him. "And she didn't cross her eyes. She had a nervous condition." Oleg Kozlov, Kaz, had a neck thick as a bull's, knuckles permanently split from brawling, and a laugh that could draw smiles from men who'd just buried their brothers. He'd survived Stalingrad by making soup from wallpaper paste and rat meat, then joked it was the best cuisine he'd had since his mother's kitchen. The Germans shot him twice and typhus nearly took him once. Yet there he was, somehow still telling filthy jokes that echoed down our marching column. "You know what I'll do after we win this damn war?" He'd ask, leaning close enough that I could smell the Makorka tobacco on his breath and see the scar where his left ear had partially detached from frostbite. "Open a shop selling officers' boots, all those fancy leather ones we keep finding on dead Nazis. If we live that long," I'd say, shifting my pack where the strap had rubbed my collarbone raw. He'd spit on the ground, a ritual for warding off bad luck. "After what we lived through at Kursk, death checked our papers and sent us back, Sasha. We're too stubborn to die properly." I believed in something then. Not Stalin. We'd learned to mumble the right phrases while keeping our true thoughts locked behind our teeth. But Russia herself. I thought if I endured enough, bled enough, killed enough, my mother would never go hungry again. My sister's children would grow up without learning to fear the sound of boots on stairs at midnight. I wanted medals to send home, proof that their Sasha helped save the motherland. That delusion died in a Romanian village whose name I still can't pronounce, in a church with secrets older than Christianity itself. Facing an enemy bullets couldn't stop. Let me tell you what happened. My hands still work, my mind still sees it all, and these truths must outlive me, must be written down while I still have strength to hold this pen. The village materialized through the twilight mist, like something conjured by a spell, a cluster of slate-roofed houses wedged between Carpathian peaks that jutted from the earth. Our ZIS-5 trucks had lurched and complained through 26 kilometers of nightmare roads since dawn. We'd lost one to an axle snapped clean through when it hit a shell crater. Another had its fuel line punctured by what might have been a sniper's bullet, or just a loose piece of metal on the road. Sergeant Baranov cursed both possibilities equally as he siphoned what remained of the gasoline using rubber tubing from a dead German motorcycle. Davai, move those lead asses," Captain Yezov bellowed, throat raw from shouting and cheap Romanian tobacco. A former NKVD officer, Yezov wore his pistol holster conspicuously open, a reminder that retreat meant his bullet before the enemy's. "You think the fascist pigs are brewing tea while waiting for you to arrive? Move." My stomach had been eating itself since morning. The last of my black bread had gone stale 2 days before, and the tin of Tushanka beef I'd been saving had disappeared from my pack, likely into Grekov's belly. The column halted so abruptly that men collided with each other, curses rising in 3 dialects of Russian and 1 Kazakh. Then an unnatural silence fell like a heavy cloak. The village was wrong. Not the ordinary wrong of war. No craters from artillery shells, no corpses sprawled in frozen postures of flight, no hungry dogs sniffing at collapsed doorways. This was absence. The communal well stood with its bucket hanging motionless. A scrap of laundry on a line didn't stir despite the breeze that rustled through our column. No smoke from cooking fires, though sunset was the time when even the poorest homes would be preparing whatever passed for supper in this part of Romania. "Would you look at that?" muttered Kaz. I edged toward the nearest house, kicking aside a fallen door. My boot connected with something that skittered across warped floorboards, a wooden spoon, still crusted with what might have been polenta. "Krov," I said softly. "Blood. But no bodies." Kaz squatted beside me on haunches thick from years of farm work before the draft notice came. He ran one blunt finger along the stain's edge, brought it to his nose. "Not fresh. Maybe 2 days old." He glanced up, eyes narrowed. "But where are the bodies? Even the Germans don't usually cart away dead villagers." He straightened, joints cracking, and spat on the ground. Perhaps the local goats formed a people's revolution, overthrew their human oppressors and established a goat soviet. He raised a fist in mock solidarity. "Workers of the barn, unite. You have nothing to lose but your..." "Zatkness, shut up," growled Pyotr, but not unkindly. No one laughed, but the absurdity of Kaz's words punctured the oppressive silence momentarily. We fanned out through the village, moving in threes as we'd learned after the disaster at Kharkov. My PPSH-41 submachine gun felt reassuringly solid against my shoulder, its drum magazine fully loaded with 71 rounds. I'd counted them individually that morning, a ritual that had kept me alive so far. "Sasha," Pyotr whispered, nudging me with his elbow. The boy who'd once sold newspapers in Smolensk now had a sniper's dead-eyed stare, but something had finally broken through his battle numbness. He pointed with his Mosin Nagant toward a horse cart, abandoned mid-street. I approached carefully, scanning rooftops and windows for movement. The cart sat at an odd angle, as if the horse had suddenly reared and twisted before... What? Vanishing? The traces hung empty, leather straps crumpled on cobblestones. The wooden wheels bore dark splashes that had dried to flaky brown, not just on the spokes, but spattered across the bed of the cart in patterns like grotesque Rorschach ink blots. Kaz knelt to examine the stains, the perpetual half-smile gone from his face. He ran calloused fingers over the dark material, which crumbled at his touch. When he looked up, something in his eyes had changed. "Either this poor bastard's horse sprouted wings," he muttered, voice dropping to a register I'd never heard from him, "or the devil himself passed through here." He caught my gaze and added, "I'm hoping for the wings, Sasha." I tried to smile, felt my lips crack from dehydration. Wings it is, then. We continued our grim search, stepping around obstacles that seemed placed deliberately to unnerve us. A child's cloth doll with button eyes that stared accusingly from a puddle. A family Bible splayed open to Revelations, its pages turning in the breeze as if read by invisible fingers. A single felt boot, Valenki, standing upright as though its owner had simply dissolved while wearing it. "Vot," hissed Surin, our Siberian scout. His finger pointed toward the village center, the word barely audible but carrying like a thunderclap through our nerves. The church hulked against the darkening sky, its stones blackened by what might have been fire, or something worse. The bell tower had partially collapsed, and the cross atop the steeple had been twisted until it pointed earthward rather than toward heaven. Even from 50 meters away, I could make out the crude crucifix nailed to the massive oak doors. Upside down, the figure contorted in ways that made my stomach clench. My fingers found the small wooden talisman beneath my uniform shirt, a Finno-Ugric symbol my babushka had pressed into my palm before I boarded the troop train. "Keep this close, Sashenka," she'd whispered, her breath smelling of garlic and fear. "Never set foot in an unholy place. It draws the things that live in the spaces between what is and what should never be." I'd kept it. Not from superstition, I told myself, but because it was the last thing she'd given me before the telegram arrived announcing her death in the bread riots. Captain Yezhov strode to the front of our group, his jaw set in that way that brooked no argument. "We'll establish our command post there," he declared, jabbing a finger toward the church. "Second squad, secure the perimeter. Third squad, check those buildings for supplies. I want defensive positions established before full dark." No one protested, though I felt Kaz tense beside me. Even the most hardened atheists among us felt something wrong about that building. Night fell like an executioner's axe, Sudden, complete, final. We set up our positions according to training, but men kept glancing toward the woods and hills beyond the village boundary. Surin had climbed what remained of the bell tower, his Tokarev pistol ready as he scanned the approach roads with German binoculars we'd stripped from a dead officer at Poltava. "Движение," he called down suddenly, voice tightening. "Movement on the eastern road. 7 figures, black uniforms." The words rippled through our ranks like electricity. It was the SS, the worst of the worst, who burned villages and had refined cruelty into something like art. We'd seen what they left behind in Ukraine. Through the gathering darkness, their shapes resolved into men, a small patrol moving with the peculiar shambling gait of soldiers who've marched too far on too little food. Even at a distance, I could make out the Silver Death's head insignia that marked them as SS. Yezhov's teeth gleamed white in his dirt-streaked face. "Zasada," he ordered, the word for ambush sending us scattering to position. "Let them enter the square. Fire on my signal." His eyes held the fierce joy of a wolf who has spotted wounded prey. The SS patrol shuffled directly into our killing zone, jackboots scraping against wet cobblestones. Their Stahlhelm helmets tilted downward like mourners at a funeral, shoulders slumped beneath rain-sodden wool uniforms. When they reached the marker Yezhov had designated, a half-collapsed well at the center of our encirclement, he spat a single word through teeth-stained brown from Makorka tobacco. "Ogon." Our weapons blazed in a familiar cacophony, my PPSH-41 bucking against my shoulder as I squeezed the trigger in controlled bursts, ejected casings pinging against stone. Kaz's DP-28 light machine gun hammered from the right flank, its distinctive circular pan magazine silhouetted against the fading light. Pyotr's Mosin barked 3 times, each shot finding its mark with the precision that had earned him a sniper's patch. Stone chips exploded from the cobbles. 5 Germans jerked and spasmed as 7.62mm rounds tore through leather and wool and flesh, bodies twisting as they slumped into positions that only the dead can assume. All except one. He stood unmoving in the center of our fusillade, a figure so still he might have been carved from bone. My third burst had swept directly across his torso. I'd felt the familiar vibration of hits transmitted through my weapon. I'd seen his greatcoat ripple as rounds tore through it. Yet he remained upright, untouched, a vertical shadow against the horizontal bodies of his comrades. The firing ceased abruptly, leaving only the high-pitched whine in our ears and the acrid stink of cordite mixing with the copper tang of spilled blood. A half-loaded clip fell from Zhuganov's trembling hands, clattering against the stones with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. The SS officer, Obersturmführer by his collar tabs, stood with hands raised to shoulder height. His greatcoat hung open, revealing a uniform tunic beneath. Where bullet holes should have been, the fabric appeared untouched. His face was oddly symmetrical, cheekbones high and sharp enough to draw blood. His hair was so black it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the fading twilight. Yezhov recovered first, striding forward with his TT-33 pistol extended, rage masking the fear that flickered behind his eyes. He jammed the muzzle against the German's forehead hard enough that the skin dimpled around the barrel. "Name?" he demanded. German words mangled by his Ural Mountains accent. "How did you—" He cut himself off, aware that asking how the man had survived would acknowledge the impossibility we'd all witnessed. The prisoner's lips parted slightly, revealing teeth too white, and even for a soldier in the field. "Maximilian," he replied, voice barely above a whisper yet somehow audible to all of us. The word carried a strange resonance, as if spoken not by one voice but by several layered atop each other. I stared at his uniform, noting discrepancies. The death's head insignia on his cap was standard SS, but the patch on his collar displayed not the usual lightning runes, but an intricate spiral pattern that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from the corner of the eye. On his left breast pocket was another symbol, concentric circles surrounding what might have been a stylized tree or perhaps a dagger. Kaz jumped down from the garden wall where he'd set up his position, DP-28 still trained on the prisoner, finger white-knuckled on the trigger. "Sasha," he hissed, all traces of his usual humor scoured away. I put at least 15 rounds into this, Fritz. Either we've been issued practice ammunition, or this Sukinson made a bargain with something darker than Hitler's rear end. Yezhov broke the frozen tableau by gesturing to Baranov and Lentov. Take his weapons and secure him. We're bringing him to the church until I can radio command. His voice carried a forced certainty, as if by treating this as a routine prisoner capture, he could make it so. The two men hesitated fractionally, then moved to flank the German. They removed his belt with its holstered Luger and ammunition pouches. I noticed neither man actually touched the prisoner directly, handling only his equipment with the tips of their fingers, like men removing a snake from their path. The other dead Germans sprawled across the square, blood pooling beneath them, turning black in the twilight. Already Grekov was kneeling beside one corpse, pulling off a pair of leather boots that looked nearly new. Surin extracted a silver cigarette case from another's pocket, while Zhuganov collected identity papers and dog tags. Nothing unusual. This was how we supplemented our meager supplies, how we found small comforts in the vast machinery of war. The dead had no need of such things. We began marching our prisoner toward the church when movement flickered between two damaged houses. A withered figure emerged, a woman so ancient she seemed composed more of sinew and bone than flesh. Wrapped in black rags that might once have been a proper dress, she was bent nearly double, her spine curved like a shepherd's crook. White hair escaped from beneath a faded kerchief in wild strands, framing a face so deeply lined it resembled cracked earth during drought. Her eyes, however, burned with a fierce clarity that belied her years. She hobbled directly into our path, those burning eyes fixed not on us but on our prisoner. Recognition flashed across her face, followed immediately by naked terror. Without warning or preamble, she spat. Not the casual expulsion of phlegm I'd seen countless babushkas direct at German corpses, but a deliberate act that propelled not saliva, but a mouthful of dark, viscous blood. It spattered against the cobblestones at the prisoner's feet, forming a pattern that looked disturbingly deliberate. The old woman raised one gnarled finger, its nail yellow and curved like a bird's talon, and shrieked a single word that cut through the evening air like a blade. Strigoi. The word seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with significance I didn't understand, but instinctively feared. Then she switched to broken Russian, her voice dropping to a hoarse, urgent whisper. Niet, niet. Do not bring him here. Church is already cursed. He will make it worse. Kill you all. She made a warding gesture with both hands, fingers twisted into configurations I'd seen my own grandmother use against the evil eye. This not man. This is Strigoi. Old evil. Hungry evil. Yezhov stepped forward, pistol raised, now pointed at the crone. Shut your mouth, old woman, or I'll shut it permanently. Step aside. But she continued, her eyes never leaving the prisoner's face, words tumbling out in a desperate mixture of Romanian and mangled Russian. Please, soldiers, listen. He drinks blood, wears dead men's faces. Your bullets cannot harm. Must use fire, blessed silver, sacred earth. The prisoner, Maximilian, watched her with the mild interest of a scientist observing a specimen, head tilted slightly to one side. Kaz leaned close to me, his breath warm against my frozen ear, smelling of tobacco and the garlic sausage he'd traded 3 cigarettes for that morning. Strigoi, he muttered. My grandmother told stories. It's their word for the walking dead. Vampires, demons, those who return hungry from the grave. Every goddamn village in these mountains has tales of them. I nodded stiffly, though my fingers had already found the wooden talisman beneath my uniform. Not from belief, I told myself, but because my grandmother had made me promise never to remove it in battle. Some wisdom transcends borders and languages. Some fears are universal. Remove this old witch, Yezhov shouted. 2 soldiers moved to flank the woman, rifles raised. But before they reached her eyes locked with the prisoners in a moment of terrible recognition. Something passed between them. A silent communication that raised the fine hairs along my arms despite the layers of wool and cotton covering them. Then she seemed to fold in on herself, withdrawing back into the shadows between buildings, her voice trailing behind her. A stream of words in a language older than the village itself, with rhythms that suggested incantation rather than speech. We forced our unresisting prisoner through the massive oak doors of the church. The interior struck our senses like a physical blow. The expected smells of a rural Orthodox church, beeswax candles, aged wood, lingering incense, were overwhelmed by newer, fouler odors: charred timber, excrement, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else. A sick, sweet smell like meat beginning to turn. Our boots echoed on stone floors stripped of carpets. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and shell casings glinted dully in corners. The altar had been desecrated systematically, not with casual vandalism, but with what appeared to be ritual precision. Icons lay face down, their reverent faces scratched away with knife points. A large crucifix had been inverted, the Christ figure partially melted as if held over flame, then nailed back in place with railroad spikes driven through the palms the wrong way, from back to front, so the points protruded obscenely. A marble statue of the Virgin had been pushed from its pedestal, its head cracked open on the floor, the remaining face bearing fresh chisel marks in patterns that formed no recognizable symbols, but nevertheless created a nauseating sense of wrongness. "Bliad," whispered Pyotr, making the sign of the cross openly despite the risk of reprimand from Yezhov, who took the party's atheism seriously. I tried to tell myself this was just ordinary desecration, the work of bored soldiers or deliberate psychological warfare. Germans, especially SS, made a policy of attacking the things their enemies held sacred. Or perhaps local fascist sympathizers had done this to curry favor with their occupiers. But as I watched our prisoner survey the ruined church, I caught a fleeting expression cross his face. A slight curve touched his lips, as if he had entered a room prepared specifically for his arrival. We were walking into something ancient and waiting, I realized with sudden clarity. And whatever waited had been hungry for a very long time. "Chain him there," Yezhov ordered, jabbing his finger toward rusted iron rings embedded in the wall beside the desecrated altar. The manacles we found had a patina that spoke of centuries, heavy black iron affairs with intricate locks that might have held heretics during the Inquisition. They'd been bolted into the stone wall at intervals, creating a grotesque parody of the Stations of the Cross. Someone, the Germans perhaps, or whoever had used this place before them, had obviously come prepared for prisoners. Baranov and I wrestled the restraints around the prisoner's wrists and ankles. His flesh felt wrong against my fingertips. His skin had a waxy quality that made my fingers itch after contact. He submitted to the chains without resistance. Once secured, he folded his long legs beneath him in a cross-legged position that seemed too fluid for his lanky frame, settling on the stone floor with a performer's grace. Night fell completely outside, the darkness in these mountains absolute in ways I'd never experienced in Moscow or even in my grandparents' village in the Urals. We established the usual guard rotations, 2 men at each entrance, 3 patrolling the perimeter, 2 watching the prisoner. I drew the latter duty with Grishin, a former dock worker from Sevastopol with a scarred face and hands like shovels. The shadows in the church corners seemed to resist our kerosene lanterns, gathering in viscous pools that shifted when viewed directly. The prisoner remained unnaturally still in his chains. Every so often, when the lantern light caught his face at certain angles, his features seemed to ripple subtly, like a reflection in disturbed water. I rubbed my eyes, blaming exhaustion, but Grishin had noticed it too. I caught him crossing himself repeatedly during our 4-hour watch. "His face is wrong," Grishin whispered, voice barely audible. 1 minute sharp, next minute round. Eyes moved too far apart, then closer together. His thick fingers twisted a tarnished medallion of St. Christopher hanging beneath his uniform. Around 2,200 hours, Kaz sprawled across a broken pew near our position, his massive frame making the ancient wood creak in protest. His face in the lamplight looked haggard, the perpetual grin now forced, dark circles under his eyes betraying the truth behind his bravado. "We should raid the village houses for supplies," he said, pulling a crumpled pack of Bellamore cigarettes from his breast pocket. He tapped one out and offered it to me. I accepted, though I hated the cheap Paparosa cigarettes with their hollow cardboard tubes that always burned my lips. It was the ritual that mattered, not the smoke. "You know what, Sashenka?" We should become business partners after this godforsaken war. I drew on the harsh tobacco, feeling it scorch my lungs. The familiar lightheadedness provided momentary relief from the gnawing anxiety that had settled in my gut since entering this village. What sort of business? I asked, playing along. Kaz's fantasies about post-war life were familiar comfort by now, like folk tales repeated by a favorite uncle. His eyes lit up, crow's feet crinkling at the corners. Civilian shoes. Can you imagine? Every demobilized soldier in the Red Army will need decent boots that aren't regulation issue. He gestured expansively with hands stained yellow from tobacco. We'll buy them cheap from peasants in Ukraine, sell them at triple price in Moscow markets. Pure profit. You'll need government permits, I pointed out, exhaling blue smoke that coiled toward the ceiling like a restless spirit. And connections with the supply officials, and details. Kaz waved away my concerns with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Minor obstacles for men who survived Stalingrad. I know a supply colonel from Minsk who owes me for that bottle of Armenian cognac I found him in Kharkov. Pyotr, who'd been cleaning his rifle bolt nearby, erupted in unexpected laughter, the high, slightly hysterical sound echoing off the stone walls. Bože moj, Kaz, you couldn't sell Valenki to a barefoot man in February. Remember when you tried to trade those genuine leather belts to the locals outside Poltava? They were made from old tire rubber. The laughter felt good, necessary, a temporary anchor to normality. But as I joined in, my eyes drifted to our prisoner. His pale face had tilted upward, watching our mirth with the faint smile of a parent indulging children's games at bedtime, knowing the lights would soon go out. His gaze met mine across the lantern-lit space, and the laughter died in my throat. Those gray eyes held ancient patience. The smile wasn't one of shared amusement, but anticipation. By midnight, the bone-deep fatigue of marching 20 kilometers through mountain terrain had caught up with me. Despite my determination to stay alert, my head kept dipping toward my chest. I propped myself against a wall, weapon laid across my thighs, allowing myself what we called a soldier's nap. Those precious moments of half-consciousness where the body rests, while some vigilant part of the mind remains on sentry duty. A scream ripped through my dreams like a bayonet through flesh, high-pitched, desperate, choked off with a wet gurgle that told me instantly this was no ordinary nightmare. My eyes snapped open to darkness broken only by the guttering flame of a single lantern. I lurched to my feet, the PPSH coming up automatically in hands trained by 2 years of combat. Kaz was already on his feet, cursing fluently in Russian, Ukrainian, and the Tatar dialect he'd picked up as a boy. What happened? Who screamed? Over here, Pyotr called, voice cracking with fear. He stood near the northern transept, his shadow stretching grotesquely across the floor. I stumbled toward him, boots slipping in something wet. The sickly sweet copper smell hit me before my eyes adjusted enough to see blood. A trail of it smeared across the stone flags from an overturned pew toward the western doors. Not droplets, but a wide swath, as if a grievously wounded man had been dragged, pumping arterial blood with each remaining heartbeat. I crouched, touching the nearest puddle with my fingertips. Still warm, I muttered, and not fully congealed. Recent. Something glinted in the trail, a 7.62 millimeter cartridge casing, its brass surface still faintly warm to the touch. I picked it up, sniffed it. The sharp bite of burned powder confirmed it had just been fired. Bliad, Kaz whispered, holding his lantern higher. It's Misha's position. Where is he? Mikhail Sokolov, Misha, had been stationed at the northwest corner of the church, a conscript from Leningrad who'd survived the 900-day siege only to be thrown into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Barely 19, with a poet's soul in a half-starved body, he'd been writing a letter to his mother when I'd last seen him. "Misha!" I bellowed, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. No response came but the startled fluttering of pigeons in the rafters. The prisoner remained exactly as we'd left him, chained to the wall, legs still folded beneath him. His expression was a mask of perfect indifference, eyes half-lidded as if bored by our panic. The guard nearest to him, Lentov, stood rigid at his post, fingers white-knuckled around his rifle. "He hasn't moved a centimeter," Lentov insisted before we even asked, his voice pitched too high. "I swear on my mother's grave, he's been sitting there like a statue this whole time." Yet the blood trail beginning 10 meters from where the prisoner sat chained told a different story. It traced a path outside, where it vanished into the churned mud of the churchyard. Surin burst through the main doors, breath coming in gasps that steamed in the cold night air. His Siberian features were taut with tension. Perimeter guards heard nothing until the scream, he reported. No gunfire, no movement, no struggle. One moment silence, then shouting from in here. By now, the entire squad had awakened. Captain Yezhov emerged from the small room off the sacristy he'd claimed as his quarters, uniform jacket unbuttoned, pistol already in hand. "Report!" he barked, eyes bloodshot from the bottle of Romanian plum brandy he'd been working through earlier. "Sokolov is missing, comrade captain," I said, straightening to attention despite the absurdity of military protocol in this moment. Blood trail from his position to outside, one shot fired, no body. Grekov, always the first to look for simple explanations, spat on the floor. "Desertion. The little Pizda has been complaining since Odessa. Probably shot himself in the arm for an excuse to run." "Then where is he?" Pyotr challenged, gesturing to the blood trail. "A man losing this much blood wouldn't get far." And why drag himself outside? We formed search parties, combing every corner of the church, the collapsed bell tower, the crypt entrance, blocked by fallen debris, the small rooms where priests had once prepared for services. We found nothing but dust, rat droppings, and more evidence of the systematic desecration that had preceded our arrival. When we regrouped, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine despite the sweat soaking my undershirt. The prisoner's posture had subtly shifted. He still sat cross-legged, still appeared outwardly calm, but now his chin was lowered slightly, his eyes half closed in an expression I recognized with visceral certainty. The same expression my uncle would wear after a particularly satisfying meal, when he would pat his belly and sigh with contentment. Yezhov growled, stalking toward the chained man. "You! Where is my soldier? What did you do?" His hand twitched toward his pistol, restraint visibly eroding with each step. The prisoner raised his head. The lamplight caught his eyes, reflecting back with the same greenish-gold glow I'd seen in wolves during night operations in the Ukrainian forests. His lips curved upward. Yezhov's control snapped. He lashed out with the barrel of his TT-33 pistol, striking the prisoner across the face with enough force that the crack echoed through the church like another gunshot. The German's head snapped sideways from the impact, a normal enough reaction that several of us exhaled in unconscious relief. At least he responded like a man to physical violence. But when he turned back to face us, that relief curdled into horror. His skin, which should have shown the angry red mark of the pistol barrel, perhaps already darkening into bruise, remained unmarked. No blood, no swelling, not even the transient redness of struck flesh. His face might as well have been carved from marble. "What the hell are you?" Yezhov whispered, the captain's bluster evaporating like morning mist, leaving naked fear in its place. The prisoner's smile widened incrementally. He said nothing, but his eyes moved from face to face among us, lingering on each, as if memorizing features or selecting the next course at a banquet. Dawn crept through the boarded windows in thin strips that did nothing to warm the church interior. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight, our breath hanging in pale clouds despite it being late spring. By 0700 hours, every man's nerves were scraped raw from fatigue and the gnawing certainty that something was deeply wrong. Conversations died mid-sentence when Yezhov or Politruk Morozov passed by. Men clustered in twos and threes, speaking in muttered fragments. I watched Lukin, a tank mechanic from Kiev who'd survived 3 burning T-34s, make the sign of the cross with oil-stained fingers when walking past our prisoner. Baranov, the squad atheist who'd once pissed on a roadside shrine for laughs outside Minsk, now kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor whenever he approached that corner of the church. Pyotr grumbled as we hammered salvaged planks across the shattered stained glass windows. The nails we'd scrounged from the village blacksmith shop were handmade, irregular spikes that bent unless struck perfectly straight. My thumb was already purple from 2 misplaced hammer blows. This vampire nonsense. There's a rational explanation. The Germans probably drugged us. They've been experimenting with hallucinogens. Remember those Wehrmacht prisoners at Kursk who claimed they'd been given pills? Very scientific, Kaz snorted, dragging a massive oak pew across the stone floor to reinforce our barricade. Despite the church's bone-deep chill, sweat plastered his undershirt to his barrel chest and darkened the armpits of his uniform jacket. Misha decided to donate 2 liters of blood to our floor, shoot 1 round for dramatic effect, then waltz out of a church surrounded by armed guards. Perhaps he tunneled under the foundations using his entrenching tool, while whistling the International? Pyotr's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His eyes darted toward the prisoner, then away quickly, as if afraid to be caught looking. Maybe there are passages we haven't found. These old churches have priest holes, escape tunnels. The SS could have screwed themselves with their own jackboots. Kaz interrupted, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But that thing isn't SS. Not anymore. I focused on my work, hammering with more force than necessary. The physical exertion helped quiet the crawling unease that had settled under my skin like lice. My attention kept drifting to the strange markings carved into the stone walls, symbols that resembled Cyrillic, but weren't quite right, as if someone had learned our alphabet through a fever dream. When viewed directly, they appeared static, but in my peripheral vision, they seemed to writhe subtly, like the slow undulation of underwater plants. Petunin, a former seminary student before the purges had made religious education a ticket to the Gulag, traced 1 symbol with a trembling finger. "This is pre-Christian," he whispered to nobody in particular. "Old Dacian, maybe Scythian. My grandfather showed me cave paintings with marks like these. They're hunger signs." When Politruk Morozov glared in his direction, Petunin quickly added, "Primitive superstitions of the pre-revolutionary peasantry, of course." "If I'd known we were being assigned church renovation duty," Kaz grunted, jamming the end of a pew against the doorframe, "I'd have requested hazard pay and a bottle of Samagon." He spat on his palms before hefting another bench. "Or at least a damn hammer that wasn't made during the time of Peter the Great." My mouth twitched in a reflexive smile. Kaz's gallows humor had kept me sane through 2 years of the Eastern Front's horrors. But the laughter froze in my throat when I caught the prisoner watching us from his corner. His eyes followed our movements with the predatory focus of a cat watching birds through a window. Around midday, Pyotr called me over to a small alcove that might once have been a confessional. "Sasha, look," he urged, holding up a scuffed leather satchel emblazoned with the double lightning bolts of the SS. "Found this wedged behind a fallen statue." I crouched beside him, rifling through the contents. Inside lay a sheaf of papers covered in cramped Gothic script, some bearing the official letterhead of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research division obsessed with archaeological and occult evidence of Aryan superiority. Diagrams had been meticulously drawn on some pages, concentric circles marked with runic inscriptions, human figures positioned at cardinal points with their organs labeled in German. Other pages showed symbols identical to those on our prisoner's uniform collar. My university German was poor, mostly scientific and technical vocabulary, but sufficient to decipher fragments. Blutkreislauf appeared repeatedly. Blood circulation. Totenkreis was another common term. Circle of the dead. One yellowed page contained what appeared to be field notes from the Carpathian region, describing local legends of revenants called Strigoi, who achieved immortality through blood rituals. "Listen to this," I translated haltingly for Kaz and Pyotr, who had gathered around. "Subject responds to traditional containment methods, silver, sacred symbols, but only temporarily. Physical damage regenerates within 3 to 7 minutes depending on severity. Subject M has been secured for transport to Facility 27 for further testing as Übersoldat prototype." I looked up at my comrades, the Nazi term for super soldier hanging in the air between us. "Typical Nazis," Kaz remarked, scratching his stubbled jaw with dirt-encrusted fingernails. "Why win with panzers when you can summon demons from hell?" His laugh was hollow, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stone chamber. I continued examining the papers, growing colder with each translated passage. One described successful integration of prehistoric Carpathian blood rituals with modern scientific method. Another referenced harnessing the hunger drive for military application. A third contained a clinical description of a feeding observation that turned my stomach. Precise measurements of blood volume consumed, time to complete exsanguination, and notes on the subsequent mimicry abilities. As I studied these horrific documents, a harsh scraping noise from the altar area cut through the church's silence like a blade. Every man froze, weapons instinctively raised. A small mirror that Grishin had propped against a pillar for shaving had tilted of its own accord and smashed against the stone floor. The guard stationed nearest swore vehemently that they hadn't touched it, hadn't even moved in its direction. I raised an eyebrow at this display from a man who carried a party membership card, and he shrugged. My babushka would whip me from the grave if I didn't. The scattered mirror shards caught the wan afternoon light filtering through the boarded windows, creating brief, dancing reflections across the church walls. Something about those fragments triggered a memory from the previous night. Something I'd noticed but dismissed. "Kaz," I said quietly, pitching my voice below the general murmur. "Did you notice something strange about that mirror before it broke? When it reflected him?" I didn't need to specify which him I meant. Kaz's face went through a series of minute expressions. Confusion, realization, then a forced casualness that didn't reach his eyes. Ancient mirror, Sasha. Probably warped with age. Glass flows like honey over centuries, did you know? My uncle was a glazier before the Germans bombed his workshop. He clapped my shoulder with a hand that trembled slightly. "Besides, your eyes play tricks when you're running on cigarettes and fear." But I remembered what I'd seen. The prisoner's reflection had lagged behind his actual movements by a fraction of a second, as if the mirror image were a separate entity mimicking him with imperfect timing. When he'd turned his head, the reflection had completed the motion only after a perceptible delay. I'd attributed it to the uneven glass surface or my exhaustion, but now... Kaz saw the certainty in my eyes and dropped the pretense. "Duh," he whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell the sour pickles and black bread he'd had for breakfast. I saw it too. The reflection moved wrong, like a puppet controlled by a drunk puppeteer. But if I admit that to myself... He trailed off, eyes haunted. Better to blame bad glass and tired eyes, Sasha. That evening, as spring sunlight faded behind the mountains, our radio operator finally established contact with division headquarters. Through the static came new orders. An NKVD Spetsgruppe commander named Dmitry Volkov would arrive tomorrow to interrogate our unusual prisoner. The Special Forces team would then transport him to a secure facility for extended questioning. Another political butcher to complicate things. Probably thinks himself too important to shit in an outhouse. Grekov muttered sarcastically. Yezhov either didn't hear this insubordination or chose to ignore it. His face had acquired a grayish pallor over the past 24 hours, and the hands that refolded the orders trembled visibly. "New duty assignments," he announced, his parade ground voice now roughened at the edges. "2-man teams. Rotation every 4 hours. No one guards the prisoner alone." He gestured toward Kaz and me. "Ivansov, Kozlov, sweep the western section of the village for supplies. Any canned food, medical supplies, ammunition. Be back before dark." I nodded acknowledgement, relief washing through me at the prospect of escaping the church's oppressive atmosphere, if only for a few hours. As Kaz and I stepped through the massive oak doors into the open air, he inhaled deeply, like a man who'd been underwater too long. "Slava Bogu," he exclaimed, crossing himself again without any attempt to hide the gesture. "One more hour in there with our pale friend, and I'd be ready to believe in everything my grandmother warned me about. Vampires, Rusalki, the whole bestiary of nightmares." The late afternoon sunlight felt like a blessing on my face after the church's perpetual twilight. But as we trudged toward the western houses, I couldn't shake the image of the prisoner's eyes following our departure. Patient, calculating, and above all, hungry. The village revealed its full desolation under the harsh spring sunlight. What had seemed merely abandoned in the previous evening's gloom now displayed its wounds with obscene clarity. We moved from Izba to Izba like battlefield scavengers, our canvas sacks mostly empty despite thorough searching. The Germans had picked the place clean before us, and whoever had come before them had taken anything of value. I kicked through a pile of rotting potatoes in what had been someone's root cellar, the stench of decay making my eyes water. A child's wooden horse lay broken in the corner, its red paint chipped and faded. On the walls above, crude crayon drawings depicted stick figure families holding hands beneath a yellow sun, artwork interrupted mid-creation, never to be completed. Nichevo, I muttered, using the Russian catch-all for nothing to be done. My supply bag held only 3 usable 7.62mm cartridges salvaged from a spilled German ammunition box, a half-empty tin of shoe polish, and a tarnished Orthodox cross I'd pocketed without examining my motives too closely. "Find anything?" I called to Kaz, who was ransacking a kitchen cupboard in the adjacent room, the sounds of his rummaging echoing in the empty house. "Gavno," he replied. "Shit," his voice muffled by distance. "Not even a damn potato. The fascists took everything worth taking, even stripped the copper wiring from the walls." I moved to the doorway connecting the rooms. Kaz stood with his back to me. Massive shoulders hunched as he pried at a floorboard with his entrenching tool. Dust motes swirled around him in the beam of sunlight piercing the grimy window, giving him an oddly ethereal appearance despite his bulk. "What do you think happened here?" I asked, stepping over a child's dress that had been trampled into the dirt floor. "Besides the obvious. Germans, I mean." Kaz straightened, slapping dust from his knees. His face had acquired a gauntness in recent months that made his cheekbones jut sharply beneath 3-day stubble. He'd lost nearly 20 kilograms since Kursk, his once burly frame gradually consumed by the war's constant hunger. "Same thing that's happening all over this fucking continent," he said, testing another floorboard with his boot heel. "First, the local fascists came for anyone with money or education. Then the Germans arrived and shot anyone who looked at them sideways. Then the retreating Germans took anything not nailed down. Standard sequence." He paused, squinting through the window at the distant church spire. But what? Something's not right here. You feel it too. Don't lie." He gestured vaguely with hands blackened by decades of motor oil and gunpowder. "I've seen 100 dead villages from Ukraine to here. This place, it was dying before the first German boot print. Look at the gardens." I followed his gaze through the window. The small plots behind each house that should have been sprouting early vegetables lay untended. Not just recently, but for seasons. Overgrown with a tangle of weeds that suggested years of neglect. "Like they knew something bad was coming," I murmured. "Long before the war." Kaz nodded grimly. "Exactly. Like animals that sense an earthquake hours before it hits. These people were leaving before the shooting started." He shook himself, like a dog throwing off water. "Come on, let's check that barn across the way. Might be some tools we can use." We continued our search house by house, the silence between us comfortable in the way only silence between old comrades can be. In the 4th cottage, I found a hidden cache of home-canned preserves, pickled cabbage and beets in cloudy jars, probably a year old, but still edible. My stomach growled at the sight. We hadn't had fresh vegetables since crossing into Romania. "Kaz, look here." "Actual food," I called, carefully wrapping 2 jars in a scavenged shirt to prevent breakage. "Kaz?" No answer came. I straightened, suddenly aware of the profound silence. The ambient sounds of his movement, boots on floorboards, muttered curses, the occasional metallic clang of his rifle butt against debris, had stopped. "Kozlov?" I tried again, my voice echoing in the empty rooms. "Oleg Ivanovich, where the hell did you go?" Nothing but the distant cry of a crow answered me. I stepped back into the main room, scanning for signs of his passage. The front door stood half open, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight that sliced through the dimness. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a prisoner demanding release. Yesterday, Misha had vanished in seconds, leaving nothing but a blood trail and a spent cartridge. Now Kaz had disappeared just as suddenly. A cold sweat broke out across my shoulder blades despite the mild spring day. "Kaz!" I shouted, abandoning stealth as panic surged through my system. I burst through the front door, scanning the village street in both directions. "Kozlov!" My voice bounced mockingly off abandoned buildings. I began a frantic search of nearby structures, my PPSH-41 held ready, finger twitching near the trigger. The storage shed, empty save for broken tools. The chicken coop, nothing but moldy straw. The outdoor kitchen with its brick oven, cold and abandoned. I sprinted towards the larger barn at the village edge, boots kicking up dust from the road. Kaz. As I rounded the corner of the collapsing structure, a movement caught my peripheral vision. A figure emerged from behind the barn's far side, walking with the rolling gait I'd recognize anywhere. Kaz. Relief washed through me with such intensity that my knees nearly buckled. "Thank God, Oleg," I gasped, bending to brace my hands on my thighs as I caught my breath. "You disappeared." I thought. The words died in my throat as he drew closer. Something was wrong. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. "Korosho," he said. "I'm fine." But the intonation was wrong, the accent misplaced. Kaz had grown up in the Tatar region. His Russian had always carried the distinctive rolling cadence of that area. Now he sounded like a Moscow radio announcer, each syllable too precisely formed. "You scared the shit out of me," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady as cold dread pooled in my stomach. "Where the hell did you go?" He stared at me for 3 full seconds. I counted each heartbeat, before his lips stretched into an approximation of his familiar grin. The expression didn't reach his eyes, which remained flat and somehow observational. "Sorry, Sasha. Thought I saw something moving behind the barn." His laugh was mechanical, a rehearsed sound lacking Kaz's natural resonance. Went to check. Nothing there. I forced a shaky smile. "Next time, warn me before you go wandering off." After Misha. I didn't finish the sentence. We resumed our scavenging, but the easy camaraderie had vanished like morning mist in summer heat. I kept him in my peripheral vision as we worked, noting dozens of tiny discrepancies. Kaz had always moved with the efficiency of a skilled mechanic. Now his gestures seemed studied, as if he were operating unfamiliar machinery. He picked up objects with a curious detachment, examining them briefly before discarding them with none of the colorful commentary that usually accompanied his scavenging. "Remember that factory girl in Stalingrad?" I asked, testing him. "The one with the red hair who gave you her address? You swore you'd marry her if we both survived." "Da," he answered, the word falling flat. "The factory. Stalingrad. Nothing more. No elaboration, no ribald joke. No reminder that I'd been too shy to talk to her friend despite obvious interest. When we finally returned to the church courtyard, laden with our meager findings, this Kaz thing disappeared without our customary joke or shared cigarette. He simply walked away mid-conversation, moving with a peculiar stiffness toward the far side of the cemetery. "Strange," muttered Pyotr, who had been helping unload our sacks. "Kaz seems off." "Just tired," I replied automatically, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "We all are." I joined the men reinforcing the church windows with salvaged planks, but my mind remained fixated on Kaz's transformation. Twice I hammered my thumb instead of the nails, barely feeling the pain through my distraction. As dusk approached, I spotted Kaz's distinctive silhouette at the edge of the churchyard, standing motionless beside a tilting gravestone. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on my holstered Tokarev pistol. "Kaz," I called softly, when still 5 meters away. "You all right? Are you wounded?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dessert dry. His lips curved upward in a parody of his familiar smile, but the eyes, Christ, his eyes, were filmed over with a milky glaze that reflected the dying sunlight like tarnished coins. "Sasha," he stammered, the name gurgling in his throat as if he were speaking through liquid. "I saw, behind the barn, something." His words slurred together, consonants melting into unintelligible sounds. I stepped closer, professional concern temporarily overriding the primitive warning bells clanging in my brain. Now I could see what the collar of his uniform had partially concealed. A gaping wound across his throat, the edges ragged and partially congealed. The wound was hours old at minimum, yet I'd been with him all afternoon, and he'd been uninjured when we'd separated at the barn. "Kaz, what happened? Tell me." I reached for him, medical training taking over. Apply pressure. Stop the bleeding. But there was no active bleeding to stop, just an impossibly severe wound that should have killed him instantly. "I'm fine," he said, with sudden clarity. Each word precisely enunciated despite the ruined throat from which it emerged. "Just fine, Sasha." He smiled again, wider this time, revealing teeth stained brown with what might have been blood. Horror rose in me like bile. I placed my palm against his chest, feeling for the reassuring thump of a heartbeat. He flinched at the contact, not the natural reaction of a wounded man, but a delayed, calculated movement, as if he'd had to consciously remember how to respond to being touched. Nothing. No heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, just the unnatural warmth of his flesh beneath the rough fabric. Whatever I was talking to was not Kaz, not anymore. Before I could process this impossible realization, a strangled cry erupted from the church's open doors. Lantern light spilled across the courtyard as men poured out, weapons raised. I turned reflexively toward the commotion. When I looked back, the Kaz thing had vanished as completely as morning dew under July sun. Inside, someone was shouting. "Petunin," I thought. "By the altar. Come quickly." I sprinted after the others, blood roaring in my ears, thoughts fragmented by terror and confusion. A body, face down in a congealing pool of blackish blood. The familiar broad shoulders and cropped hair were unmistakable even before Yezhov knelt and rolled the corpse onto its back. Kaz stared sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling, his throat cleaved open from ear to ear with surgical precision. The wound gaped like a second mouth, the white knobs of cervical vertebrae visible through shredded tissue. His chest had been split open from sternum to navel, the ribcage pried apart like a wooden crate. The room tilted sideways. I staggered, catching myself against a pew. I hadn't emptied my stomach at the sight of death since my first month at the front. But this obscenity, broke something in me. "Impossible," Grekov was muttering, pressing his fist against his mouth. He was just outside. I saw him walking the perimeter not an hour ago. "I spoke with him 10 minutes ago," Baranov insisted, crossing himself repeatedly. He bummed a cigarette from me near the well. "But he's been dead for hours," Surin said, prodding the corpse's rigid arm with his rifle barrel. "Already in full rigor. Look at the blood, completely coagulated. How could a man be seen walking, talking, interacting normally when his actual corpse lay cooling and mutilated? The logical impossibility of it struck each of us differently. Grekov began reciting the Lord's Prayer in a strangled whisper. Petunin vomited onto his own boots. Yezhov stood frozen, face bleached of color, hand compulsively opening and closing around his pistol grip. Through the silence came a sound that froze my blood, a soft, satisfied chuckle from the shadowed corner where our prisoner sat chained. Every head turned toward the sound. The SS officer, the thing we'd thought was merely an SS officer, watched us with undisguised amusement. His posture remained relaxed, cross-legged, hands resting lightly on his knees. But his eyes gleamed with feral hunger in the lamplight, and his lips curved in a smile that displayed too many teeth. "Yebat!" Volkov snarled, lunging toward the prisoner with drawn pistol. Yezhov caught him by the arm. "Stop!" our captain ordered, his voice cracking. "Don't approach him! Don't!" He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing against his collar. Just watch him. From a distance. The prisoner's gaze swept over us like a searchlight, settling finally on me. Recognition flickered in those pale eyes, a predator acknowledging the prey that had glimpsed its true nature. His smile widened fractionally, and in that moment, I knew with bone-deep certainty. He was aware I had spoken with the thing wearing Kaz's form. He had wanted me to know. It was all part of some game whose rules I couldn't begin to comprehend. My knees gave way, and I sank onto a pew, Kaz's lifeless eyes still staring accusingly from the floor. A memory surfaced unbidden, my grandmother's withered hand gripping mine with surprising strength as she whispered ancient warnings. When the dead walk among the living, speaking with stolen tongues, it means a Vypyvyushchi is feeding, a drinker of souls. Such creatures wear their victims like we wear coats, Sashenka. They take more than blood. They take memories, voices, everything that makes a person himself. I'd laughed then, secure in Soviet modernity and scientific atheism. The revolution had supposedly freed us from such primitive fears. News of Kaz's death and his impossible replacement spread through our unit like typhus through a prison camp. By morning, the church reeked of fear sweat and too many cigarettes smoked with trembling hands. Men who yesterday had merely been uneasy now jumped at shadows, eyes darting to corners where lamplight couldn't reach. We posted triple guards at every entrance, men standing shoulder to shoulder with bayonets fixed. Though what defense is steel against something that can wear your dead friend's skin like a borrowed greatcoat? I saw Kaz at 2100 hours, I swear it, Grishin insisted, his scarred face twitching with nervous tics. He was checking rifle bolts near the vestry, asked me for a smoke. Impossible, Lukin countered, fingers compulsively working his prayer beads. I was with the body when Doc Sorokin examined it. Rigor mortis in full effect. Been dead since mid-afternoon at least. Captain Yezhov prowled the church like a caged animal, hollering orders that grew increasingly desperate as discipline frayed visibly around him. His face had acquired a grayish pallor that reminded me of corpses I'd seen pulled from the Don River after 3 days underwater. The next man who mentions vampires or demons will face summary court-martial. He barked, pistol drawn but trembling noticeably in his hand. This is psychological warfare, advanced German tricks to undermine morale, nothing more. But his bloodshot eyes never rested on the prisoner for more than a fleeting second. And he'd taken to touching the small Orthodox cross he kept hidden beneath his uniform. The same cross he'd once threatened to confiscate from Petunin for religious displays unbecoming a Soviet soldier. Meanwhile, Politruk Morozov had fallen eerily silent, abandoning his usual political lectures about Soviet scientific superiority. When Grekov asked him directly what Moscow would make of our situation, the political officer simply muttered something about reporting factual events only, and retreated to a corner with his notebook, writing feverishly what looked suspiciously like a final testament. Pyotr, the seminarian's son who'd spent 2 years hiding his family's religious background, now made the sign of the cross openly, muttering prayers between drags on the Makorka cigarettes he chain-smoked with trembling fingers. The hammer and sickle pin on his uniform collar had mysteriously disappeared, replaced by a crude wooden cross fashioned from 2 splinters bound with copper wire. "My babushka warned me," he whispered when we huddled together during the brief moments when terror gave way to exhaustion. "Stay away from the Carpathians," she said. "Old things sleep in these mountains. Things from before Christ walked the earth." Around midday, Baranov emerged from what remained of the church library, clutching a half-burned leather-bound volume. His hands shook so badly that ash flaked from the charred pages as he laid it carefully on an overturned ammunition crate. "Found this wedged behind a fallen bookshelf," he announced, voice cracking. "It's mostly in Romanian, but there are sections in Church Slavonic that I can make out." He'd been an academic before the war, a linguistics professor specializing in Slavic dialects until the NKVD had decided such expertise made him potentially dangerous. Men gathered around as Baranov traced lines of ornate text with a dirt-encrusted finger. The pages were illuminated with intricate illustrations that matched the symbols adorning our prisoner's uniform, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. concentric circles surrounding a stylized tree or perhaps a dagger. "Here, listen to this part," Baranov read, his academic's voice steadying as he translated. "The strigoi feeds not merely on blood, as common folklore suggests, but on terror itself. Through consumption of the victim's heart and vital organs, it absorbs memories and personality, enabling it to assume the exact form of those it has consumed. It walks among the living as a perfect mimic, betrayed only by subtle inconsistencies in behavior and the absence of reflection." "Nonsense," Yezhov snarled. "Complete nonsense," snatching the book from Baranov's hands. "This is exactly what the fascists want, to reduce Soviet soldiers to superstitious peasants." He shoved the volume inside his tunic. "I'm confiscating this garbage before it further contaminates your minds." But I'd seen the fear flash across his face as Baranov read. The captain wasn't immune to the creeping dread that had infected us all. As night descended again, the temperature inside the church plummeted despite the spring warmth outside. My breath misted before my face as I huddled beneath my greatcoat on a broken pew, staring at the vaulted ceiling. A patchy fresco stretched overhead, once glorious angels wielding flaming swords against demonic forces. Someone, perhaps the original desecrators, had systematically defaced one section, transforming the angels into grotesque, bat-winged creatures that more resembled the demons they were fighting. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of ancient timbers, every whisper of draft through broken windows became the rustling movement of something inhuman. My PPSH-41 lay across my chest, drum magazine fully loaded, though some part of me understood its futility. We'd pumped the prisoner full of lead once already. All we'd accomplished was ruining his uniform. Sometime during that endless night, my watch had stopped at 3:17, the hands frozen despite my attempts to wind it. I heard soft footsteps on the stone floor, not the heavy tread of booted soldiers, but something lighter, almost furtive. I sat up slowly, every muscle tensed, rifle coming up by reflex. Through the dimness, illuminated only by a single guttering candle near the altar, I made out a silhouette standing beside our chained prisoner. My blood froze solid in my veins. Kaz's unmistakable broad-shouldered outline was there, the profile I'd recognize from 1,000 meters through field glasses. Not possible. I'd helped wrap his mutilated corpse in a canvas tarp myself, carried him to the makeshift morgue we'd established in the church's cold cellar. Yet there he stood, or rather, there stood the thing wearing his form. One pale hand extended toward the prisoner's face in a gesture almost like benediction. The two locked gazes in what appeared to be silent communion, neither moving, neither speaking, yet somehow communicating in ways I couldn't comprehend. My hand scrabbled for the kerosene lantern beside my pew, fingers clumsy with terror. The metal base caught on a splinter and tipped over with a clatter that sounded deafening in the midnight silence. "Damn it!" I hissed, fumbling for matches. By the time I'd righted the lantern and struck a phosphor match against the stone floor, the Kaz thing had vanished like morning mist in sunshine. Only the prisoner remained, still chained in his position against the wall, legs folded beneath him in that peculiar cross-legged posture he never seemed to abandon. But something had changed. His face, previously impassive, now bore an expression of subtle satisfaction, like a man who has just enjoyed a particularly fine meal, but is too well-mannered to comment directly. At the corner of his mouth, a single droplet of dark liquid, too thick and black to be ordinary blood, glistened in the wavering lantern light. I approached cautiously, my rifle aimed squarely at his chest, though I knew from bitter experience that bullets would be as effective as spitting on a forest fire. My finger trembled against the trigger guard. "What did you do to him?" I demanded, keeping my voice low to avoid waking my comrades, who somehow slept through this nightmare. Perhaps their exhaustion was stronger than their fear, or perhaps, more terrifyingly, they weren't actually sleeping, but had been rendered insensible by some power I couldn't begin to understand. The prisoner said nothing. His pale eyes tracked my movement with the focused intensity of a wolf watching a wounded deer struggle through deep snow, patient, calculating, certain of eventual success. The droplet of black fluid at his mouth's corner caught the light, gleaming like oil. I swept my lantern in a wide arc, checking shadows and corners for any sign of the cause thing's presence. Nothing. The church's vast interior swallowed the feeble light, shadows seeming to retreat just beyond the lantern's reach, no matter where I directed it. I whispered into the darkness. "Where are you, bitch?" half hoping and half dreading an answer. None came. My comrades slept on, or lay insensible, their forms huddled under greatcoats, faces buried in the crooks of their arms. "You won't take any more of us," I said, my attempt at fierceness betrayed by the quaver in my voice. The words seemed pathetically inadequate even as they left my lips. The prisoner's mouth curved upward slightly at the corners. Then, for the first time since his capture, he addressed me directly, in flawless Russian, with only the faintest inflection suggesting it wasn't his native tongue. His accent carried strange, ancient cadences that reminded me of church Slavonic liturgies I'd heard as a child before the revolution closed our village church. "I will take all of you, one by one," he said, voice soft as falling snow yet somehow carrying to my ears with perfect clarity. He tilted his head slightly, studying my reaction with clinical detachment. "Fear seasons the meat," he added almost conversationally. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my lantern. By dawn, I was a quivering wreck, nerves frayed to breaking point, muscles aching from hours of tension. But beneath the terror, something else had crystallized, a hard kernel of resolution. I wouldn't wait passively for this thing to hunt us, one by one. If war had taught me anything in 2 bloody years, it was that you either acted or you died. Sometimes you acted and died anyway, but at least you met your end on your feet, not cowering in a corner. So while most of the squad collapsed into exhausted sleep after dawn's stand-down, I slipped away to search the church's ancillary rooms. In the kitchen pantry, I found what I sought: a cloth sack of coarse salt, the kind used for preserving meat. In the groundskeeper's shed attached to the church's northern wall, rusty iron horseshoes hung from pegs, along with farming implements and a barrel of lamp oil that had somehow escaped German looting. I was gathering these materials when Pyotr appeared in the doorway, his young face aged a decade by strain and fear. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his cheeks had hollowed dramatically in just 48 hours. "What are you doing, Sasha?" he asked, watching as I filled my canvas bag with horseshoes and iron nails pulled from rotting fence posts. "Something desperate," I admitted, meeting his gaze directly. "Something my grandmother taught me. Folk remedies against..." He couldn't bring himself to name what we faced. "Da," I nodded. "Will you help me, or report me to Yezhov for superstitious deviancy?" He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped fully into the shed, closing the door behind him. "What do you need me to do?" "Cover for me," I said, hefting the now heavy bag. "I want to try something that will sound insane. After what I've seen, nothing sounds insane anymore." His laugh held an edge of hysteria. "What's the plan?" I explained quickly. A binding circle of salt, reinforced with iron at cardinal points, sanctified with prayers and sealed with consecrated oil. The same method my grandmother had described for trapping a leshy that was stealing children from our village when she was a girl. "You realize we'd face a firing squad for this in normal circumstances," Pyotr muttered, but he was already helping me distribute the materials into smaller pouches for easier concealment. Folk magic is hardly consistent with Marxist-Leninist principles. "If we survive, they can shoot me later," I replied grimly. We waited until mid-morning, when exhaustion had claimed most of the squad and only 2 guards, Mironov and Dashko, remained watching the prisoner. Both men leaned against the wall, eyes half closed from 24 hours without proper rest. Rifles cradled in slack arms. I approached casually, salt bag partially concealed beneath my tunic, Pyotr trailing behind with the iron implements hidden in a folded blanket. Trying to appear nonchalant, I began sprinkling salt in a wide circle around the chained prisoner, starting at what I hoped was the eastern point. "What the hell are you doing?" Mironov frowned, straightening from his slouch against the wall. "Captain's orders," I lied smoothly, not breaking the rhythm of my salting. "He wants the floor around the prisoner sanitized. Discipline, you know. Can't have the church looking like a pigsty when that NKVD commissar arrives." Mironov exchanged a dubious glance with Dashko, but neither had the energy to argue. They'd seen too many inexplicable horrors in the past 48 hours to question a relatively normal activity like cleaning, even if the timing seemed odd. "Whatever," Dashko muttered, stifling a yawn. "Just don't get too close to him." His eyes flicked nervously toward the prisoner, then away, as if afraid to make direct eye contact. I completed my circle, careful to ensure no gaps in the salt line. Pyotr handed me the iron pieces, 6 horseshoes and a dozen nails, which I placed at what I estimated were the cardinal and ordinal points of the compass around the circle. Finally, I uncorked the small flask of lamp oil I'd brought, dripping it in a thin line just outside the salt boundary. Other members of the squad had begun to notice our activity. Baranov approached cautiously, recognition dawning on his academic's face as he observed the pattern taking shape. Grekov and Lukin watched from across the room, whispering to each other with wide eyes. Even Polytruk Morozov paused in his endless writing to observe, though he quickly returned to his notebook when he caught me looking in his direction. When I had completed the circle to my satisfaction, I stood back, heart hammering against my ribs like an artillery barrage. The prisoner observed my work from his seated position within the circle, his expression one of aristocratic disdain tinged with something that might have been amusement. "Davai," Pyotr whispered beside me. "Go ahead." I closed my eyes briefly, searching my memory for the prayer my grandmother had taught me in secret. Old words, pre-Christian words mixed with Orthodox phrases added by generations who'd tried to reconcile ancient practices with newer faith. The Russian came back to me in fragments, mixing with Ukrainian and Church Slavonic in a patchwork of half-remembered sounds. I began softly, voice gaining strength as the rhythm of the words returned. By fire and salt, earth and steel. I continued the incantation. As I spoke, the prisoner's expression changed. The contemptuous smirk faded, replaced by something harder, colder, a hatred so ancient and pure that it seemed to lower the temperature in the immediate vicinity of his body. When I finished the improvised prayer, he spoke again, his perfect Russian flowing like honey laced with arsenic. "Your grandmother taught you children's games. They will not save you from what comes," he said, every syllable precisely articulated. I forced myself to laugh, though my knees had turned to water and threatened to buckle beneath me. "We'll see," I managed. For a moment, silence stretched between us, taut as piano wire. Then the prisoner's gaze dropped to the salt line encircling him. With deliberate slowness, he leaned forward and spat on the floor, just outside the barrier. "Stay back," I warned the others, several of whom had instinctively stepped forward at this display. "Let's see if it holds." Perhaps, just perhaps, we had contained him temporarily. But as I looked into those ancient eyes, I knew with bone-deep certainty that salt and iron were merely delaying tactics. Whatever this thing was, it had survived centuries of humans with their desperate folk remedies and religious symbols. It would be patient, it would wait, and when the moment came, it would feed. At 1638 hours precisely, our fragile equilibrium shattered with the distinctive sound of Gaz M1 engines growling outside the church. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Nikolaevich Volkov of the NKVD's Special Operations Directorate arrived with the calculated intimidation that had become the organization's hallmark. He entered without knocking, leather boots striking the stone floor with sharp reports that silenced all conversation instantly. Volkov wore the NKVD's blue-topped service cap and immaculate greatcoat, despite the spring warmth, the azure tabs on his collar bearing the 3 enamel squares of his rank. 2 junior officers flanked him like matching Dobermans, thin-faced men with identical leather document cases and Tokarev pistols worn high on their hips for easy access. "Report the situation," Volkov barked at Yezhov without preamble. His gaze swept across our salt circle, the iron horseshoes, the oil-soaked perimeter. "What primitive, superstitious garbage is this?" Have you forgotten you command a unit of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, not a band of Carpathian goat herds? Captain Yezhov snapped to attention, sweat instantly beading his forehead despite the church's chill. Tovarish Starshий Lieutenant, he began, using Volkov's formal rank and title. We have experienced anomalous circumstances. 2 men are missing, presumed dead. 1 body recovered with... Anomalous? Volkov interrupted, the word dripping with contempt. Elaborate. His cold gray eyes swept over us like NKVD searchlights raking a prison yard. Several men instinctively found reasons to study the floor. Perhaps the men directly involved should explain, Yezhov suggested weakly, gesturing toward Pyotr and me. Volkov pierced me with his stare. At 35, he was relatively young for his position, his face unlined save for 2 deep furrows between his brows, the permanent mark of a man who has ordered countless executions without losing sleep. Govorite, he commanded. Speak. I settled for carefully selected facts, starting with the ambush of the SS patrol and the prisoner's inexplicable immunity to bullets. The German prisoner exhibited unusual resistance to conventional weapons, I stated, adopting the clinical language I thought might appeal to Volkov's presumed scientific rationality. Multiple direct hits confirmed by 12 witnesses, yet no visible damage sustained. Pyotr continued where I left off, describing Misha's disappearance and the discovery of Koz's mutilated corpse. His voice remained steady until he mentioned the Koz doppelganger. At that point, a slight tremor crept in despite his obvious efforts to control it. I spoke with Kozlov myself after his death, I added, meeting Volkov's eyes directly. Something wearing his face, using his voice, but wrong. Inhuman. With each detail we provided, Volkov's expression grew more contemptuous. The slight flaring of his nostrils, the incremental narrowing of his eyes, these told me everything about his thoughts before he even spoke. The Romanian peasant woman identified the prisoner as a Strigoi, Pyotr concluded, pointing to the book Yezhov had confiscated. The local folklore matches exactly what we've witnessed. The book contains... Stop! Volkov slammed his gloved hand against a pew, the crack echoing through the church like a pistol shot. Stop this nonsense immediately. Do you realize the report I would have to file if I took this seriously? Dear Comrade Beria, please allocate resources to combat vampiric fascist super soldiers. I'd be in Kolyma breaking rocks before the ink dried. He stalked toward me, stopping precisely 47 centimeters from my face, close enough to intimidate, far enough to maintain authority. You're allowing primitive folklore to interfere with your duty to the Soviet people, he said, voice lowered to a razor-edged whisper. This prisoner potentially possesses crucial intelligence about SS operations in the region. The motherland requires his knowledge. Comrade Stalin himself has ordered increased intelligence gathering from high-ranking captives. The invocation of Stalin's name sent a shiver through the assembled men. I with respect, comrade, I said. I've spent 2 years fighting fascists from Stalingrad to Romania. I know what Germans look like when they die. I know what blood and wounds look like. What we've witnessed defies scientific explanation. This man is not human. If we don't keep him contained, we're all dead, and he'll be loose in the motherland. Volkov's top lip curled slightly, the only visible reaction to my insubordination. I applaud your imagination, Ryadovoy, he replied, deliberately using the lowest rank, private, though I was a sergeant. However, your fantasies are irrelevant. I have direct orders to interrogate this prisoner and transport him to Moscow for further questioning. I expect full cooperation. His hand drifted meaningfully toward his holstered Tokarev. Or I will find reasons to suspect counter-revolutionary activities among this unit. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Throughout this confrontation, the prisoner observed silently from within his salt circle, chains slack around his wrists, as if worn for decoration rather than restraint. One corner of his mouth quirked upward in what might have been a suppressed smile. Then, with exquisite timing, he spoke. His cultured voice carried effortlessly through the church, cutting through our argument with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Yes, take me to your motherland, he said, his eyes fixed on Volkov with predatory intensity. "Feed me your armies, your cities, your children. War is so very nourishing." The last word, nourishing, rolled from his tongue with obscene pleasure, like a gourmet savoring a rare delicacy. Something flickered across Volkov's face, a momentary crack in his bureaucratic armor. "Psychological warfare tactics," he announced dismissively, though I noticed he wouldn't look directly at the prisoner now. "Advanced German conditioning. You've all fallen for it like superstitious babushkas." As if responding to the prisoner's words, the weather outside transformed with unnatural suddenness. Through the church's broken windows, we watched storm clouds boil up from behind the mountains, racing across the spring sky at impossible speed. Within minutes, thunder rolled across the valley. "Unnatural weather," Grekov muttered, crossing himself openly despite Volkov's presence. That's when she appeared again, the ancient Romanian woman, materializing in the church doorway as suddenly as if she'd stepped through a curtain. Her black kerchief couldn't contain the wild silver hair that framed her face like storm clouds around a mountain peak. "She's back," Pyotr whispered, nodding toward the crone. "Remove this old woman," Volkov ordered, gesturing sharply toward his subordinates. One of the junior officers moved to comply, hand dropping to his holstered pistol. The old woman ignored him completely, her rheumy eyes fixing on me with unsettling directness. She raised a twisted finger, pointing first at me, then at the sky beyond the broken windows. "You tried," she said in broken, heavily accented Russian. It wasn't enough. She shuffled 2 steps into the church, her stick tapping against the stone floor like a blind man's cane. The NKVD officer halted his approach, something in her demeanor giving him pause despite Volkov's orders. "When blood moon rises, he breaks free," she continued, her voice dropping to a guttural whisper. The prisoner stirred at these words, chains clinking softly as he shifted position. For the first time since his capture, I saw what might have been genuine emotion cross his face. Anticipation, hunger, a predator scenting prey. "Enough of this circus," Volkov snapped, drawing his pistol with a fluid motion that spoke of regular practice at the firing range. "Remove her now or I'll shoot her as a fascist collaborator." The old woman spat on the threshold, not in defiance, but in ritual, the same gesture she'd made upon first seeing the prisoner. Then she turned and vanished into the deepening gloom outside. Through the doorway, I glimpsed the eastern horizon where the moon would soon rise. Storm clouds churned and parted momentarily, revealing a sliver of crimson along the mountain ridge, like a wound opening in the darkening sky. That night unfolded like the first act of Ragnarok. The temperature plunged so rapidly that water in our canteens turned to slush within an hour. The brass pocket watch I'd taken from a dead German officer at Kursk registered -7 degrees Celsius despite it being mid-April. Through gaps in the storm clouds, the moon emerged, a crimson orb that leaked bloody light across the landscape. Even hardened veterans like Grekov, who'd survived the meat grinder at Rzhev, where his division lost 80,000 men, found reasons to remain inside rather than face that unnatural sky. Through this miasma, our prisoner seemed to have grown somehow, his presence expanding to fill the church like poison gas. He tested his chains methodically, muscles rippling beneath his uniform tunic with inhuman strength. Each movement produced a metallic screech that set teeth on edge. The salt line we'd placed around him sizzled and popped whenever drafts carried it toward his flesh. "Post men at 6-meter intervals," Captain Yezov ordered, voice pitched higher than usual. "Ammunition check, balance between internal and external positions." His orders made tactical sense, but the tremor in his hands betrayed his deteriorating composure. Volkov paced near the altar, leather boots striking the stone floor with sharp cracks that punctuated his boasting. "I once extracted a full confession from a Vlasovite general in 43 minutes, he announced to nobody in particular, adjusting his blue-piped NKVD cap. "The human pain threshold is entirely psychological. With proper technique, anyone can be broken." His subordinates nodded mechanically. Then suddenly, it began as a soft sound barely audible above the howling wind. Then it built, note by note, into a cackle that seemed to emanate not just from his throat, but from the walls themselves. Men clutched their ears, some dropping to their knees. "Shut up," I managed, stumbling forward despite every instinct screaming retreat. "Shut up, devil." My PPSH-41 aimed at his face, though I knew bullets had proven useless. "What's so funny?" Without answering me, with a casual flick of his wrist, the gesture a university-educated man might use to dismiss a servant, the prisoner gestured at his chains. A concussive wave exploded outward from the prisoner's body. I flew backward as if struck by a truck, ribs cracking against a wooden pew. Chaos erupted. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, screaming men. Baranov's legs snapped with an audible crack as a heavy baptismal font toppled onto him. Grekov emptied his entire magazine into the ceiling, blind panic overriding decades of weapons discipline. "Fire by squads!" someone shouted. But coordination had disintegrated. Men discharged weapons at anything that moved, bullets ricocheting off stone walls and ancient columns. "Stop!" Volkov bellowed, his NKVD authority momentarily reasserting itself through the chaos. "Cease fire immediately! You'll damage the asset!" Between one heartbeat and the next, the prisoner was among us. Not running. Nothing so human or comprehensible. I tracked his movement by the aftermath. Petunin was lifted bodily and hurled against a stone column with such force that the back of his skull exploded in a pink mist. Lukin was pinned to the wall, feet dangling half a meter above the floor as the creature's hand plunged into his throat, fingers emerging from the back of his neck dripping gore. The creature's eyes radiated red light as he moved, matching the moon visible through the shattered window. His uniform had split along the seams, revealing skin like polished marble beneath, too perfect and symmetrical to be human flesh. I crawled through dust and debris toward a fallen pillar, lungs burning from smoke and powdered stone. Around me lay the bodies of men I'd fought beside for 2 years. A hand gripped my shoulder, nearly triggering me to lash out with my entrenching tool before I recognized Pyotr's dirt-streaked face. "We must run, Sasha!" he shouted above the continuing gunfire and screams. "This is madness!" He was right. Whatever this thing was, we couldn't fight it with Mosin rifles and communist doctrine. But running blindly into the night seemed equally fatal. Then I remembered, during our earlier search for supplies, I discovered a heavy wooden door behind the altar, iron-bound and ancient, leading to stone steps that descended beneath the church. The crypts. I gasped, gripping Pyotr's arm hard enough to bruise. Under the altar, there's an entrance. Understanding flashed across his battered face. He nodded once, then glanced around for the clearest path to the altar. Through gaps in the mayhem, I could see the creature, no longer possible to think of it as a prisoner or even a man, moving methodically through the remaining fighters. Volkov and his NKVD subordinates had formed a triangle near the main doors, firing their pistols. The bullets struck the creature but caused no more harm than raindrops striking a tank. "On 3, I whispered, gathering my legs under me for a sprint. 1, 2, 3. We launched ourselves toward the altar, zigzagging through overturned furniture and fallen bodies. My boot slipped in a pool of blood, nearly sending me sprawling before Pyotr's hand steadied me. My final glimpse of the main church hall burned itself into my memory with photographic clarity. The creature, lifting Volkov by his neck as the NKVD man emptied his pistol point-blank into its face without effect. The blue-piped uniform cap had fallen away, revealing Volkov's thinning hair and the absolute terror that had finally broken through his ideological certainty. Around them, muzzle flashes strobed through the smoke-filled air as the last defenders fired desperately from whatever cover they'd found. The creature's head turned as we reached the crypt door, its crimson eyes meeting mine across 30 meters of chaos. Recognition flashed in those inhuman orbs, not of me specifically, but of the fact that prey was escaping. We plunged through the doorway and down worn stone steps, the darkness below swallowing us as completely as a grave. Behind us, the screams of dying men pursued us like vengeful ghosts, their pitch and tenor suggesting deaths that medical textbooks had no terminology to describe. "I've been in this hospital bed for 3 weeks now," watching dust motes dance in shafts of light that cut through the ward. Morphine dulls the throbbing in my shattered ribs, and the raw, weeping burns across my left side. But nothing dulls what I saw that night in the Romanian church. The doctors say my left ear will never hear again, a small price when I consider the wet sounds my comrades made as they died. How did I escape? The memory fragments like shattered glass. I remember the copper penny taste of fear as I crawled through narrow tunnels beneath the church, my palms leaving bloody prints on ancient stone. I remember Pyotr succumbing to his injuries before we made it out, leaving me as the sole witness of this hell. Then, near the village boundary, I found salvation in the form of a battered Gaz AA truck, its windshield spiderwebbed with cracks, one headlight hanging like a blinded eye. The keys dangled from the ignition, left by someone who had fled in greater haste than mine, or perhaps never fled at all. I drove without direction, following the sun until I saw the silhouettes of T-34 tanks against the horizon, the red star on their turrets the most beautiful sight I'd witnessed in 2 years of war. "Halt! Who approaches?" The sergeant's voice carried across the morning stillness, amplified by a megaphone that distorted his words into something almost inhuman. "Senior Sergeant Alexander Ivansov, 375th Rifle Regiment," I called back, my voice a broken thing I barely recognized. When the lieutenant examined my papers, his eyes moved between the documents and my face, as if reconciling two contradictory truths. "Where are the others?" he finally asked. "Dead," I answered simply. The word felt inadequate, a pebble thrown into an ocean of truth. "All dead." The regiment's surgeon noted my injuries with the detached efficiency of a butcher assessing cuts of meat. 3 broken ribs, second-degree burns across my neck and arm, lacerations deep enough to expose bone, concussion, ruptured eardrums. His hands moved quickly, competently, while his eyes avoided meeting mine. I told the truth at first, about bullets that couldn't harm our prisoner, about my dead friend's body moving through the church with something else inhabiting it, about symbols carved into ancient stone that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The doctor nodded mechanically, his pencil scratching clinical phrases: acute stress reaction, possible schizophrenic break, delusional framework consistent with combat trauma. Then came the men I'd been expecting all along. The medical staff evaporated at their approach, suddenly remembering urgent duties elsewhere. The privacy screens they pulled around my bed transformed the space into an interrogation cell, the recording device placed beside me as deliberate as a loaded pistol. I recounted what I'd seen, what I'd felt, what I'd fled from. "Your squad was entrusted with high-value intelligence," the junior officer said when I finished, adjusting his leather gloves with fastidious care. "Instead, every man under your command is dead, and the prisoner has vanished without a trace. These are outcomes that require explanation, Sergeant Ivansov." "I survived the unsurvivable," I replied, too hollow for fear anymore. "That's the only explanation I can offer." They exchanged a glance charged with unspoken communication. Then the senior officer leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the standard issue soap on his skin, see the red rim around his collar where it had chafed his neck. "There will be no vampire in your official statement," he said, each word precisely measured. "Your squad encountered a specialized SS unit employing chemical warfare agents that induced hallucinations. The church collapsed due to structural damage from artillery. The German prisoners killed your comrades during an escape attempt." "That isn't what happened," I started, but his hand came up sharply, cutting through my words like a knife. "That is exactly what happened," he corrected, voice hardening to granite. "Unless you would prefer to be tried for sabotage, dereliction of duty, and treason against the Soviet people. Consider carefully which version of events you wish to endorse, Sergeant." The final document they presented was my discharge papers, declaring me psychologically unfit for continued combat duty due to acute stress reaction and combat fatigue. I was to be returned to civilian life after recovery, with a directive never to discuss the Romanian incident in any context. I don't know if that creature died beneath the collapsed church or merely sleeps until war awakens it again. Conflict is the perfect camouflage for such horrors. Who notices a few missing soldiers in battles where thousands die? Who questions strange wounds when artillery tears bodies apart in more conventional ways? But I know this truth as surely as I know my own name. As long as humans wage war, as long as we feed ancient hungers with our violence, such things will never truly die. The evening nurse approaches with my medication, her shadow stretching across the floor like something from another world. I'll hide these pages where they won't be found immediately. If you're reading this, understand. I've carried this knowledge alone for too long. The monster was real. The deaths were real. And somewhere in forgotten places where old powers slumber, war calls to things that hunger for more than just flesh and blood. Remember when darkness falls and thunder walks the hills. Make the old signs. Speak the old words. Heed the old warnings passed down through generations. Because some enemies cannot be defeated with tanks and treaties. Some hungers never fade. Some wars never truly end. That's the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It would help me out more than you can imagine. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.